everyone, and welcome to a brief discussion catching up on the state of the war in Ukraine and Russian domestic politics. We're going to start by taking a look at the situation on the front and how things have changed over the last few months. Now, Russia's summer offensive has been a bit of a debacle. It has gained some ground, but it hasn't gained the important ground, and it's come at a tremendous cost. Now, Russia has made progress across a broad front, both in the east and south, and to a lesser extent in the north, around Sumy Oblast near Kiev. However, they've failed to take any of their key strategic objectives, particularly the city of Pokrovsk. They have made some more progress further north in Chasiv Yar near Konstantinivka. Those are the three big Russian strategic objectives right now: Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, and Konstantinivka. And they have not succeeded in taking any of them over the course of their very costly summer offensive. They've taken tremendous casualties, and they have gained ground, but they haven't gained the ground that they needed to gain. At the same time, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign has proven very effective. The Russians have paid a tremendous economic cost for the war, particularly from Ukrainian targeting of oil and gas infrastructure, which is often difficult to impossible to repair or replace. Now, the battle for Pokrovsk began in the summer of 2024, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka, which the Russians had been besieging for some time. So this failing to take the city at this point is a sign of severe weakness on the Russian part. They've only had one significant victory over the course of this year, and that was the crushing of the Ukrainian salient in Kursk in March of 2025. Now, this isn't the end of the problems faced by the Russian military. One of the reasons that they've been able to prosecute the war so effectively without a mobilization, since the end of the partial mobilization that began in September of 2022, has been that the Russians have been able to increase recruitment through the use of increased salaries and massive recruitment bonuses, which do represent life-changing money, particularly for people in the poorer regions. That's part of the reason why the human cost of the war has fallen so heavily on poorer regions and ethnic minorities. But this costs a lot, and the Russian budget is limited. They've been cutting back for the first year since the start of the war on defense spending, not by a lot, and Russian defense spending is still tremendous, but they have been forced by economic considerations to cut back slightly. And this looks like it's going to mean the cutting of some enlistment bonuses, which will affect the Russians' ability to recruit fresh recruits to fight on the front. Now, it seems, as far as I've observed, that they are not gaining substantial numbers of new troops from North Korea, and so the Russian offensive operations have depended heavily on, in addition to the effective use of air power, particularly these things called glide bombs, which have enabled Russian planes to bomb Ukrainian positions without getting in range of air defense. The other big thing that they've depended upon to carry out offensive operations successfully has been a large supply of fresh troops for these Storm Z units that carry out probing attacks to find the locations of Ukrainian positions so that more experienced, well-trained troops can attack. Now, this strategy falls apart if you don't have large amounts of new people coming into the army. And that will, unfortunately for the Russians, be compounded by the fact that they have been drawing very heavily for manpower on the prison population, and while new recruits will be coming in every time crimes are committed, of course, the kind of main bulk of the prison population that was recruitable that existed before the war has mostly been expended. There isn't kind of a pre-war buildup of prisoners that they can now draw on to send to the front. Now, as I mentioned, the Ukrainian long-range strike campaign has been very effective at putting the squeeze on the Russian budget and has created some gasoline shortages in Russia, has limited its ability to carry out exports. In general, it's been very effective. Now, a lot has been made of this in Western media. It's been promoted very positively, very heavily, and for good reason. It's a very impressive achievement. It's worked very well, and it's likely to work better and become more impressive as the Ukrainians begin fielding this new cruise missile that they have been developing, the Flamingo, which will increase range. And another thing about range is that if you have more fuel reserves, you can move more and take a more indirect path to your target, allowing you to circumvent air defenses. Now, this missile is impressive, and it's gotten a lot of good press, as has the campaign in general. However, we should be clear that the Russians are not going to give up the war, particularly Putin is not going to give up the war because of economic concerns around oil and gas production. And the Russians are not going to revolt, the Russian population is not going to revolt on account of gasoline prices, at least not sufficiently to remove Putin from power or put a stop to the war. Now, the main things that would represent an existential threat to the Putin regime in the current environment that are very unlikely to happen but are plausible, theoretically, are a loss of Crimea, and this one really plausible is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, but the loss of Crimea or a general mobilization. Now, Putin has two things going for him as the president of Russia. He's built his kind of legitimacy, his reputation on two things. He's the guy who ended the wild 90s and the chaos of the 1990s, and he's the guy who got Crimea back. Now, losing either of those things would be tremendously risky for him. Oil and gas shortages, not so much. Now, this sounds like a very positive forecast. However, Ukraine is not having the best time either. Most prominently acknowledged is the manpower crunch, which is not likely to improve in the near term, both because there's been no sign from the government that they intend to push further conscription, but also because their ability to do so has been undermined. Now, for the first few years of the war, Zelensky was in a very powerful political position, where not only did he have war powers and a majority in parliament, but he also had an incredible degree of popularity and legitimacy within Ukraine. Now, a series of political missteps and unforced errors have drained away a lot of this. Prominent cases include the firing of the commander-in-chief of the army, Valery Zaluzhny, in 2023, and more severely, the attempt to undermine and subordinate the anti-corruption agencies in 2025. Now, the draining of his political capital would make it much more difficult for Zelensky to pass increased conscription, even if it wasn't such a deeply unpopular path to take. Now, the manpower issue is not yet completely catastrophic, but it's not good. It's a problem, it's a noted problem, and it's a problem that's going to be quite difficult to solve given its status and the attitude of Ukrainian society towards it. And a year ago, it probably would have been decently easy for Zelensky to get it pushed through by essentially expending some of the political capital that he's built up by being kind of a war hero president. But he's spent a lot of that over the last 2 years in, as I said, unforced errors. And that makes it very difficult to push forward conscription, especially as conscription has become increasingly frowned upon in society. So resolving this issue is difficult, and it leads into the next issue, which is political cohesion at home. And this is, again, an area where these unforced errors that I've been talking about have been severely corrosive. Now, there was a time after Zelensky's clash at the White House with US President Donald Trump during the spring of this year that there was even talk of holding an early election after his standing in the polls went up quite significantly after this clash with Trump. Now, that didn't happen, fortunately. It would have very possibly been catastrophic if it had, because one of the big things that is holding Ukraine together is political cohesion and unity. Now, the moment that competitive politics become the way of the day again, it's going to be a very severe issue. And this unity, this cohesion, has been eroding slowly for some time, particularly as a consequence of this anti-corruption business. And the worse that gets, the worse position Ukraine will be in to negotiate an end to the war and to hold on until such a time as they can do that. Now, the economic situation also shows some signs of strain. Ukraine has had a budget shortfall for every year of the war, and up until now, that has been covered by the United States and the European countries. The issue is that this year, the budget shortfall is not only larger than expected and larger than last year, but also larger than the amount of money that the United States and Europe have pledged to cover it. So there is a $19 billion shortfall that is still uncovered by foreign backers, And what will happen to that is unknown, but obviously in wartime, state spending is very important. State spending on things like defense procurement and soldiers' salaries, which is particularly significant when you are already having a manpower shortage. In light of that, I would argue that the appropriate question is less who is winning the war and more who is losing the war faster. And that is a question that's hard to answer at this point, even close to accurately. So we're going to take a look instead at what we think the next 6 months might look like. Now, for starters, I think that the chances of the war ending within the next 6 months are extremely low. Not zero, obviously, but very low. I think the current Ukrainian defense is relatively sustainable. In the long run, past 6 months, it will depend largely on whether Ukraine can manage its budget shortfalls in such a way that they don't negatively affect the front, and whether manpower levels can be kept relatively stable, not even increasing, but not going downhill, which would be very destructive to the defensive effort. Now, on the Russian side, manpower is an issue too, but it's less an issue of whether they can maintain the war, and more of what form that takes. Now, if they can't find a way to maintain the budget while also maintaining recruitment at current or similar levels, I would expect a shift from a focus primarily on offensive operations to a focus primarily on a long-range strike campaign. Now, this shift would come either in a couple of weeks as the summer season ends and the muddy season sets in, or after the winter when there is again a muddy season that would force a pause to offensive operations on a large scale either way. Now, I would expect Putin to use this opportunity to attempt to re-engage the United States and to a much lesser extent Europe diplomatically and attempt to diplomatically isolate Ukraine while re-engaging Russia with the West. Furthermore, I would expect the first objective to be less successful than the second. I think isolating Ukraine more than it already is now would prove very difficult for him, but attempting to reintegrate Russia with the West, or at least with America, is a fairly achievable goal if offensive operations slow down and stay slowed down over the course of the winter. To sum it up, I would conclude that Ukraine is doing pretty well on the military front, but struggling on the economic and political fronts, and Russia is really struggling on both the military and economic fronts, while it is stable on the political front. The issue for Ukraine is that while it is doing decently well militarily, it has no means to compel Russia to end the war. Now, this means that unless Russia's attempts to re-engage Trump lead to another ceasefire offer that Ukraine finds potentially plausible and agreeable, Ukraine is stuck in a situation where they have no means to compel Russia to end the war, and so while they can sustain an offense in the short term, it is pitting their political and economic difficulties against Russia's ability to draw on its larger population and larger economy, and Ukraine doesn't have a visible path to victory that doesn't involve aid from the West that it is unlikely to get, or major changes on the Russian domestic political scene that are plausible but not predictable at this moment to such a degree that we can count on them or view waiting for them as a significant or serious strategy. Right now, Western media and the Western attitude seems to be extremely positive about Ukraine after an extremely negative perspective around the start of summer. That extremely negative attitude was not justified then, and the extremely positive one is not justified now. The situation for Ukraine is not catastrophic, but it is certainly not good, and it's improved a little bit over the course of the summer with the failure of the Russian summer offensive, but in the big picture it has not changed substantially. The situation remains less than ideal, and at least in the Western media and cultural bubble, undue optimism seems to be the mood of the day. This has been a discussion about the current state of the war, and thank you very much for listening.